Welcome to the 10th annual Terence Keeley Vatican lecture. One of the most dedicated members of our advisory board is Terence Keeley. And Terry came to us, let's embarrass him, he's sitting right here. Terry came to me about 11 years ago and he said, you know what we need to do is we need to make a statement about Notre Dame's relationship with the Holy See. We need to do something concrete and tangible that will bring home the special relationship, I mean, special to put it mildly, but the extraordinarily special relationship that Notre Dame has with the Vatican. And he said, you know, one of the problems that we face is that at Notre Dame, we know too little about the Holy See. And sometimes one of the problems in the Vatican is that they know too little about us. And Terry emphasized to me, the important thing is the personal relationship. The important thing is not something intangible. It's not an agreement between institutions, but it's a relationship between people that makes it possible to build our relationship with this institution in multiple ways. And Terry said, you know what I want to do is, he said, I would like to endow a lectureship that is dedicated to this challenge. And here, 10 years later, we have what has been an extraordinary event, not just for the Nanovic Institute, but for Notre Dame as a whole, and for the people who have visited us. We have had prominent archbishops give the Keeley lecture. We have had prominent cardinals give the Keeley lecture. We have had prominent archbishops who, thanks to giving the Keeley lecture, subsequently became cardinals. And we are already known within the halls of the Vatican for being that place that you have to go. But it is true, when you talk with the people who have visited us, all of them talk about how magnificent they find Notre Dame, not only its outward beauty, but its inward beauty, its commitment to its students, and to its mission. They're all profoundly impressed. So tonight, Father Jenkins wanted to be with us. He was called away to the Vatican. And so on the principle of if the representative of the Vatican comes to us, then our representative has to go to them. And but Father Jenkins was sad not to be here, and he has asked the Dean of the College of Arts and Letters, John McGreevy, to introduce our guest. John is really the perfect person to do this. He's a man with many, many talents, Lord knows. One of them is to be an administrator. But he is also an internationally recognized expert on American Catholicism, but also on the international Catholic experience, particularly as exemplified by an organization called the Jesuits. As an American and as an internationalist, he will introduce to us another American and another person who is very much an internationalist, our guest this evening.
Thank you and welcome. On behalf of Father Jenkins, Provost Tom Burrish, and the sponsors of tonight's lecture, the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, its director, Professor Jim McAdams, and our generous benefactor, Terence Keeley, I am delighted to introduce tonight's speaker. As a member of the Department of History faculty, I will begin with the most important fact about tonight's speaker, that he graduated from Notre Dame as a history major. Everything following that experience in our speaker's career has inevitably been something of a professional disappointment. But I will nonetheless mention that he took master's degrees in theology at Oxford and in medieval studies at Toronto. He trained for the priesthood at Dunwoody Seminary, north of New York City, and was ordained as a priest before the Archdiocese of New York in 1989. While pursuing his doctorate from the Pontifical Collegio Sant'Anselmo, he began work at the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, where he worked closely with then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. As Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger ordained him as Archbishop and appointed our speaker as Apostolic Nuncio to Ireland in 2011. Notre Dame veterans will recall that our speaker also gave the first Keeley lecture in 2005, beginning what has become a glittering list of presenters, including Walter Cardinal Casper, Reinhard Cardinal Marx, and Archbishop Salvatore Fischella. I am told we do not have a tape of that first lecture, but the company he now keeps in the Keeley lecture roster and the return invitation would suggest it was superb. This time we all promise to take better notes. Please join me then in welcoming Notre Dame graduate and history major, Archbishop Charles Brown, to deliver the 2015 Terence R. Keeley Lecture on the topic, The Catholic Church in Ireland and Pope Francis, Legacy and Transformation.
I thank Dean McGreevy for his very kind words of introduction. It's great to be back here after 10 years to give this lecture. I'm very, very grateful also to Jim McAdams, my friend, for having invited me. But let me say what an honor it is for me to be delivering the Terence R. Keeley Vatican Lecture. This, in its 10th year of existence, I'm personally very grateful to my friend and Notre Dame classmate, also from 1981, Terry Keeley, for having conceived the idea of this series and having made it financially possible for the last decade. I'm convinced that both Notre Dame and the Holy See owe him a great debt of gratitude. The purpose of this series is, as we have heard, to explore questions involving Notre Dame's Catholic mission with representatives of the Holy See. And when I look at the list of eminent personalities whom the Nunavik Institute has invited to deliver these lectures, some of whose names were on the screen behind me, I'm certain that present company, present speaker excluded, the series has certainly achieved its aim. I'll speak this evening on the topic of the Catholic Church in Ireland and Pope Francis, legacy and transformation. I suppose it's standard for speakers at the outset of their address to announce that they approach their topic with a certain amount of trepidation, and that is surely true for me for a number of reasons, not the least of which, well, one of which is that we have a dean of the College of Arts and Letters who is a history professor here in the audience, but also because the question of the Church's role in Irish society, and particularly the history and the evolution of that role, is a question of daunting complexity, impervious to easy analysis or prosaic formulation. And to continue my disclaimer, I must say that I also have only been in Ireland for 3 years, hardly enough time to grasp fully the profundity and the complexity of the issues about which I will speak. Then, of course, there's the question of the context in which I speak today, the University of Notre Dame, a preeminent, or perhaps the preeminent, institution associated in the minds of many, if only because of the name of our athletic teams, with what has come to be known in the last 25 years as the Irish diaspora. We need always to be aware of how a consciousness of Irish-American identity will shape the way in which we view the reality of Ireland today. So that you can better understand where I'm coming from on these questions, let me tell you why I happen to find myself in Ireland. As you've heard, I'm the Apostolic Nuncio to Ireland, which means that I'm the ambassador of the Holy See to the country of Ireland. I'm one of about 55 resident ambassadors in Dublin, representing countries from all over the world. The Holy See has full diplomatic relations with about 179 nations, Ireland being one of those 179. The first papal nuncio to Ireland arrived from Rome in 1645 in order to support the Catholics of the Confederation of Kilkenny in their struggle against English Protestant rule. The first nuncio's name was Giovanni Battista Rinuccini, and by all accounts, his mission was a bit of a failure, memorialized now chiefly by an Italian restaurant named after him in the lovely city of Kilkenny. Fast forward 284 years to 1929 and the period of the establishment of the Irish Free State. The Holy See appointed an Irish-American Franciscan, Paschal Robinson, a medievalist who had no formal training as a diplomat, as the first nuncio to the newly independent nation. His arrival in Ireland in January 1930 was described by the New York Times, and I quote, as the final act in the long drama of Catholic emancipation in Ireland, close quote, and was greeted with rejoicing in the country among everyone, save perhaps some bishops, a few of whom were, it seems, not terribly excited about having the idea of having a representative of the Holy See in their own backyard, as it were. The Irish government, however, was delighted with his arrival and provided the new nuncio with what had been one of the 3 official residences of the British governors of Ireland, that is, the one belonging to the British Under-Secretary for Ireland. That residence in the center of the Phoenix Park in Dublin became the nunciature, just as shortly before that date, the Chief Secretary's Lodge, the chief British representative in Ireland, his lodge had, or the second, I should say, the secretary, the second most important British governor in Ireland, his lodge had become the residence of the American ambassador. In a letter to the Irish ambassador to the Holy See in Rome, written in late November 1929, just before the arrival of Archbishop Robinson in Ireland, Joseph Walsh, the secretary of the Department of External Affairs of the Irish Free State, noted that, and I quote, the occupation of a papal nuncio to an Irish government of one of the 3 principal official residences of the old regime cannot but strike the imagination of the people as a symbol of a very great change indeed, close quote. And he went on to say, and I quote again, the healthy air of the park would no doubt be an argument which would appeal to Monsignor Robinson himself, close quote. I think of that line by Joseph Walsh about the healthy air of the park when I pass by the site of the old nunciature on one of my evening runs in the Phoenix Park. I should explain that the nunciature was moved out of the Phoenix Park in 1978 to our present, more humble location next to what the Irish call a petrol station on the Navan Road. Paschal Robinson served in Dublin for 18 years until his death in August 1948, and since Paschal Robinson, there have been 12 nuncios, 3 of whom, like Paschal Robinson, have died in office, a fact which gives me pause for thought and consideration. The role of the nuncio is twofold: to be the representative of the Pope to the local Catholic Church in the geographical area of his responsibility, as well as to represent the Holy Father to the governmental authorities there. Like any ambassador, a principal element of his work is to keep his own government informed of the situation in the country where he is their representative. The publication in 2010 and 2011 by WikiLeaks of confidential diplomatic cables from American embassies give an idea of the day-to-day work of any embassy in informing their own government, in that case the American State Department, of the situation in the nation where the embassy is located. Gathering information and relaying it to one's own Ministry of Foreign Affairs is a major part of the work of any ambassador, as is communicating information from one's own government to the state where one is resident. As you heard, I was appointed nuncio in Ireland in late November 2011 and arrived in the country in January 2012. One of my priorities on my arrival was to try to be as open and accessible as possible to the people of Ireland, naturally in order to make the Holy See present and visible among them, but also so that I would be able to learn from them about the country, the church, and the needs of the church at this very critical time in Ireland. I felt that there was no way I could do that by remaining enclosed in the nunciature, so I began to accept as many invitations as I possibly could to visit parishes, schools, universities, religious communities, hospitals, really anywhere where it would be possible for me to come in contact with people in order to come to a deeper understanding of the country. That 3-year experience, as limited as it surely has been, provides a background for my reflections this evening on the Catholic Church in Ireland and Pope Francis. To approach that question, I would like to mention something which happened relatively recently. Last November, one of the senior and most respected bishops in Ireland, Archbishop Michael Neary of Tuam, preached a homily at a Mass for the Association of Papal Orders in Ireland, people who have received papal honors. It was a homily which produced considerable comment. Indeed, almost a month later, it was still being discussed in the newspapers in Ireland. Why was it so significant? Well, let me give you an example. Take this passage, for instance, and I quote, "Our priests tell me of measurably declining congregations and a steady, if still quite gentle, dropping in contributions. They see few teenagers in their churches. They feel intuitively that the temporary lapsing, noticeable here from about the 1970s, is changing. They fear that those falling away in recent years will not return. I can see the same with my own eyes in our cathedral parish. Even the outright hostility we had been experiencing from sections of the media, the political establishment, and some of the public has curiously abated. This, if I'm right, the Archbishop says, is not because of the depth of our piety and the brilliance of our arguments have made them think again. This is because the whole society, like an Irish village 50 years ago, knows and is tacitly acknowledging something that needs hardly to be said, that a great struggle, social, political, intellectual, and profoundly cultural, has been fought, and that we have lost." Close quote. This paragraph, which I have just read, was by far, as you would imagine, the most cited in the Archbishop's homily. And like any passage, it needs to be understood in context. Archbishop Neary, at the outset of his reflection, makes a crucial distinction, which was not noticed by the commentators on this sermon. And that distinction was between Christendom and Christianity. The first, Christendom, signifying, and I quote from him, "a shared set of assumptions about life and its purpose, reflected in use of language, in culture, and in the law," close quote. That is Christendom as Catholic culture or Catholic society. The second category is Christianity, faith in the person of Jesus Christ and his church, which can exist and indeed usually does exist without the support of an explicitly Catholic society. One remarkable element of Archbishop Neary's homily, which wasn't commented upon in the media, but which immediately struck me, was the fact that what the Archbishop was pointing to, that is, the disappearance of Christendom in a European nation in the 21st century, was itself quite remarkable and unusual. Not because the disappearance of Christendom is something unique in itself. Indeed, Catholic culture, in the sense of a pervasively Catholic society in which social institutions, customs, and mores are publicly Catholic, has been disappearing in European countries now for centuries, but rather because this disappearance was happening in our own time. From my point of view, it has been the existence, or rather the persistence of Christendom in Ireland in our own lifetimes, which is something that is truly remarkable. And here perhaps we begin to grasp an element of the uniqueness of the situation of the Catholic Church in Ireland. Ireland is one of the very few places in the world where a pervasively Catholic culture has existed within living memory. People in Ireland today who are in their 50s would have grown up, especially those who lived outside of Dublin, in a society which was thoroughly Catholic in its external manifestations, where something like, and I don't exaggerate, 90% of the population was at Mass every Sunday, where saints' days, sacraments, and visits to holy places structured the public and private life of the community, where a large number of young men would have habitually gone to the seminary to become priests, and where an even large number of girls would have entered the convent to become nuns. It was a world of large-scale pilgrimages to places like Loch Derg, a penitential island on a lake just south of the border with Northern Ireland, Crowpatrick, the holy mountain of St. Patrick in County Mayo, and of course the shrine of Our Lady of Knock, where the Mother of God had appeared to villagers on a rainy August evening in 1879. I recently had a conversation with a religious sister in Ireland who would have entered religious life in the 1940s. She's from the west of Ireland and went to one of the convent schools run by the Sisters of Mercy in a village on the Atlantic coast. She spoke to me with great affection about what it was like to grow up in rural Ireland in the 1940s. She told me, for example, that of the 20 girls who graduated with her at her school, 15 of them entered religious life as sisters. She recounted to me how her grandfather on their farm in South Galway would semi-silently pray the litany of Our Lady of Loretto as he planted the seeds in his fields. Every seed a different title of the Mother of God: Virgin most merciful, Virgin most faithful, Mirror of justice, Seat of wisdom, Cause of our joy. It was a rural society which in most respects had not changed in 1,000 years. I might mention also in parentheses that it was this continuation of the living tradition of Christendom into our own time, which as late as 1976 led Professor John Senior of the University of Kansas to establish a semester of his remarkably successful integrated humanities program on Inishbofin, a small island off the coast of Galway. His idea was that there on an island of farmers and fishermen in the North Atlantic, American students, and this is in 1976, coming from their deracinated and sterile suburban cultures, might still come in contact with the ancient Catholic rural life of Europe. But as Archbishop Neary, whose archdiocese interestingly includes Inishbofin, mentioned last November, by the 1970s, things were beginning to change in Ireland. There are many reasons for that change, and they've been analyzed far better than I can do by people like Father Vincent Toomey and Mary Kenny in their books respectively entitled The End of Irish Catholicism and Goodbye to Catholic Ireland. But the factors which preserved Catholic culture in Ireland well into the second half of the 20th century would include not only the predominantly rural and agrarian culture of much of Ireland with its inherently conservative outlook, but also the legacy of resistance to British rule. The relationship between Irish nationalism and Catholicism is, like everything in Ireland, far more complicated than what is commonly believed, especially in the Irish diaspora. It bears noting, for example, that several of the most prominent and influential Irish nationalists were from Protestant, not Catholic backgrounds, people like Wolfe Tone and Charles Stewart Parnell. It might also be pointed out that two of the most famous women nationalists were born as Protestants but later became Catholic, Maud Gunn in 1903 and Constance Gore Booth, better known as the Countess Markievicz, in 1917. But having noted the fact of Protestant nationalism in Ireland, there can be no doubting that during the long centuries of British rule in Ireland, in which there were periods of brutal persecution and discrimination against Catholics, to remain Catholic was seen as an act of resistance to a foreign power. Catholicism was the faith of the indigenous people, the faith of the poor and the oppressed. And indeed, the conversion to the Catholic faith of Countess Markievicz, whom I just mentioned, was in part due to her desire to identify completely with the common people of Ireland. And this sense of solidarity and resistance combined with the astonishing charitable and educational efforts of Catholic religious orders and bishops during the time of British rule, meant that when Ireland became an independent nation in the second quarter of the 20th century, the Catholic Church had built up an enormous amount of goodwill among the Irish people. Goodwill which immediately translated into significant political power and social prestige for the Church in the newly founded Irish state, reflected, for example, in the decision of the new government of Ireland to provide a very prestigious residence for the new Nuncio, Archbishop Paschal Robinson. The result of this reservoir of goodwill was that from the 1930s to the 1960s, a Catholic ethos dominated Ireland as a nation. There were stringent laws regarding censorship of books and films. The Catholic Church was given an enormous role in primary and secondary education. The social legislation of the nation followed Catholic principles. We should remember, for example, that civil divorce, legal divorce, only became legal in Ireland in 1995 as a result of a popular referendum, when approximately 10 years earlier, in June of 1986, the possibility of legal divorce had been put to the nation. It was resoundingly defeated by a large margin of almost 2-1. Civil divorce prevailed eventually in Ireland only as recently as November of 1995, and by a margin of only about 9,000 votes out of a total participation of 1.6 million voters. That tells us something about the persistence of a Catholic culture and ethos in Ireland, and quite strikingly confirms what Archbishop Neary implies about the perdurance of Christendom in Ireland well into the second half of the 20th century. There are other factors which have contributed to the transformation of Irish society. Certainly the phenomenon of emigration has been an influence. The 20th century made it possible for emigrants to return to Ireland in numbers which would have been impossible in previous times. Returning emigrants brought their experience of secular societies back to Ireland. Another factor which led to the changes which we have seen in Irish society will appear to some of you as even more surprising, even more astonishing, and that change was electricity. Bringing electricity to rural Ireland only really got underway in earnest in the 1950s, at a time when hundreds of thousands of Irish households in the countryside lacked electric power. The electrification program took decades to reach everyone. The Irish Rural Electrification Scheme, as it was called, only ended in 1979. With electricity, of course, came radio and television, and with radio and television came not only the values, if we can call them that, of the media industry, but also a profound transformation of the ancient rhythms of rural life, including household prayer, which had played such a role in so many families. As a personal aside, since I arrived in Ireland 3 years ago, I've discovered second cousins with whom I am related through my great-grandmother, who emigrated to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, from a place in County Clare beside the ancient monastic site of Kilmacduagh. There, one of my cousins, who was a bachelor farmer, a typical thing in Ireland, steadfastly resisted electrification of his farm until his death in 1995. It tells you something of the kind of people that I come from. The impact of radio and television on the values of Catholic Ireland came to be exemplified in the now famous Nighty episode. Yes, you heard correctly, the Nighty episode, when virtually a half century ago in 1966, during a broadcast on the national state-owned television network RTE of the Late Late Show, a kind of talk show, the host, Gay Byrne, asked a woman what color her nightie was on her wedding night, to lots of laughter among the studio audience. The question upset the Bishop of Clonfert and led him, in all seriousness, to protest that RTE was undermining Christian values in Ireland. Not surprisingly, the bishop came out the loser in the controversy, even though RTE eventually apologized for the incident. Another factor, in addition to the influence of emigration, electrification, and the media, was certainly the gradual economic improvement of life in Ireland in the last 50 years. This gradual economic growth was certainly a factor in the transformation of the consciousness of the nation. That economic advance and transformation was assisted itself considerably by Ireland's entrance into the European Economic Community, as it was then called, in 1973. And that economic transformation reached its peak in the period now called the period of the Celtic Tiger, which lasted from about 1977 to about 2007, 2008. Finally, another more recent factor in the transformation of the position of the Church in Ireland, and one which is painfully well known to all of us, is, of course, the multitude of scandals which engulfed the Church in Ireland beginning in the 1990s, most notably and tragically the horrific crime of sexual abuse of minors by members of the clergy. The legacy of the scandals was recently assessed very well by David Quinn in his article in the magazine First Things, which he's entitled Anti-Catholic Ireland, which points out how the dominance of the bishop's voice on moral issues, exemplified by the 90 episode, for example, the dominance of the bishop's voice on moral issues in Ireland from independence in the 1920s up and through the 1980s created a situation in which the revelation, beginning in the 1990s, of the crimes of some members of the clergy and the negligence of some church authorities in addressing those crimes, that was met by absolute outrage and open hostility towards the church. It was that combination of vigorous moral teaching of the bishops through the 1980s and the uncovering of scandals shortly thereafter, which I believe would be the background to Archbishop Dermot Martin's recent comments during a lecture at Fordham University, in which he said, and I quote, "Much of the heritage of Catholic-dominated Ireland still entraps us from being free witnesses to the Christian message within a secular society that is seeking meaning," close quote. This problem becomes evident when in contemporary Ireland, a Catholic bishop attempts to speak, or for that matter, when any Catholic voice is raised regarding the critical issues of our day, the inevitable response from those opposed to that perspective is that the bishops want to return Ireland to the clerical domination of the past, to censorship and enforced doctrinal orthodoxy, a past in which politicians were fearful in that typically Irish phrase of the belt of the bishop's crozier. I think we would say the whack of the bishop's stick or the staff. And for good measure, those opposed to the church's position on any given issue will add that the church authorities were negligent in dealing with sexually abusive members of the clergy, so how dare they speak to us about morality? So it's clear from what I've been saying that the church in Ireland faces unique challenges in society today. But having said that, we must say that the church in Ireland also possesses unique resources. Attendance at Sunday Mass today, while certainly nothing like it was 30 years ago, is still significantly higher than in any other European country. The deeply held faith which permeated daily life is still within the living memory of the people. And crucially, there's a growing dissatisfaction with the superficiality and emptiness of secularism. There is, as Archbishop Dermot Martin has said, a search for meaning in life. There's an awareness that relative economic prosperity and being able to spend your vacation, they would say your holidays, in places sunnier and warmer than Ireland are not enough on their own to provide a sufficient reason for living. Finally, there is what we might call the spiritual geography of Ireland. No one who travels the land and comes to know it can remain unaware and unaffected by the hundreds, if not thousands, of ancient Christian sites, places like Kilmacduagh and Clonmacnoise and Skellig Michael, the amazing monastic island off the coast of Kerry, places where for centuries male and female monks and nuns, ascetics, sought As Pope Francis recently reminded the members of the Roman clergy, or the Roman Curia, they sought the better part, the unum necessarium, that is, a contemplation and adoration of the Lord. That sense of the spiritual world, the unseen world of saints and angels, has always been an element of the Irish consciousness. It was expressed well by Maud Gunn, the Irish feminist and nationalist whom I mentioned earlier, and who is perhaps best known for her extremely complicated relationship with William Butler Yeats. Reflecting on her own conversion to the Catholic faith, she writes, and I quote, "I never doubted the existence of spiritual forces surrounding us, some friendly, some hostile, more completely blind to human needs, pursuing their own existence with the same disregard of us as the birds or the insects. I knew it was possible to break the dividing barrier which separates us from this world, and once had been eager to do so in the hope of gaining power to further the cause to which I had devoted my life. Then I had realized the danger of playing with forces without sufficient knowledge, danger to one's own sanity, and still more, danger to those one loves and may be unable to protect. I looked on the Catholic Church as the repository of spiritual knowledge, and sometimes I longed for its protection and guidance." She goes on to write, "I believe every political movement on earth has its counterpart in the spirit world, and the battles we fight here have perhaps been already fought out on another plane, and great leaders often draw their unexplained power from this. I cannot conceive a material movement which has not a spiritual basis. It was this that drew me so powerfully towards the Catholic Church." Maud Gunn wrote these words in 1938. Her awareness of the spiritual dimension of reality was what brought her into the Catholic Church. Today, that awareness is still present among Irish people, although in our present time it may take various and even unusual forms. So while it would certainly be very mistaken to suggest that there is in Ireland today any great nostalgia for the Catholic Ireland of the 1950s, there's a palpable desire in Irish people for an understanding of life which goes beyond the merely material and visible. There's a hunger and thirst to encounter the truth of our existence, a truth which liberates because it enlightens. Certainly, these are desires which exist in every human heart, but I don't think that I'm mistaken if I suggest that in Ireland today, there continues to be a singular awareness of the need for a vision of human life that goes beyond the merely material and physical. And this recognition that there is a deep desire on the part of people in Ireland to rediscover the spiritual basis of human life leads me to reflect on the figure of Pope Francis, who I am convinced provides us with a way forward in this respect. Now, while there are many ways in which we can understand the unique contribution of this Pope, I think that one relatively overlooked element in his teaching in these last 2 years provides us with a key to evangelization in today's Ireland. And that key is the concept of freedom, so central to the thought of Pope Francis. In his programmatic document Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis reflects on the notion of freedom, and his insights are particularly relevant to the contemporary situation in Ireland. In Evangelium Gaudium, he focuses his attention on the kerygma, that is, on the initial announcement, proclamation, communication of the Christian message. And it is this: Jesus Christ loves you. He gave his life to save you. And now he is living at your side every day to enlighten, strengthen, and free you. That's from Evangelii Gaudium 164. This is the heart of the Christian message. This is what people must hear because it is the essence of the truth of Christianity. The Pope insists that the centrality of this message requires whoever seeks to communicate, whoever wants to communicate the truly good news of Christianity, to stress, as he says, and I quote, those elements which are most needed today. The communication of the message must, in Pope Francis' words, and I quote, express God's saving love which precedes any moral and religious obligation on our part. It should not impose the truth, but appeal to freedom. It should be marked by joy, by encouragement, liveliness, and a harmonious balance, which will not reduce preaching to a few doctrines which at times are more philosophical than evangelical. All this demands on the part of the evangelizer certain attitudes which foster openness to the message, approachability, readiness for dialogue, patience, warmth, and a welcome which is non-judgmental, close quote. Certainly, we see these qualities in Pope Francis, a warmth and welcome which is non-judgmental, and it is these qualities which make him such an attractive figure to the world. But his fundamental point is this: Catholic faith is truly liberating, truly freeing, and freedom cannot be imposed. If it is, it's no longer freedom. It's become something else. The transmission of the Catholic faith, he says, and I quote, has to express God's saving love which precedes any moral and religious obligations on our part, close quote. Of course, there are moral and religious obligations which we as Christians have, but these moral and religious obligations are the consequence of and not the prerequisite for faith. In the end, the truth which liberates cannot be imposed. It needs to be freely given as the good news which it truly is. And this message of Pope Francis, basic as it is, has been extremely well received in Ireland, where in the minds of many, the truth of Catholic teaching has been associated, at least in the minds of many, with control and perhaps at times even with coercion, and where in words quoted by Pope Francis himself in Evangelii Gaudium, the Church has been, quote, perceived as promoting a particular prejudice and as interfering with individual freedom, close quote. This focus on freedom, the freedom of the follower of Christ, is twofold. There's the freedom in which the essential message of the Church needs to be proposed to people in an inviting and attractive way. And then there's the freedom understood as the effect of the reception of that message in a person's life, a freedom which gives joy. Indeed, the first two sentences of Evangelii Gaudium express the connection between joy and freedom. Quote, the joy of the gospel, which is the title of the text, the joy of the gospel fills the hearts and lives of all who encounter Jesus. Those who accept his offer of salvation are set free from sin, sorrow, inner emptiness, and loneliness. The first two lines of Evangelii Gaudium. But we would be guilty of misrepresenting Pope Francis's message regarding freedom were we to end the discussion simply by affirming the freedom with which the Christian message needs to be proclaimed and received. Pope Francis is also very clear on the fact that personal freedom cannot be an excuse for self-centered, narcissistic superficiality. True personal freedom is found in God, the source of our very existence. The Pope writes, and I quote, although it sounds obvious, spiritual accompaniment must lead others ever closer to God, in whom we attain true freedom. Some people think they are free if they can avoid God. They fail to see that they remain existentially orphaned, helpless, homeless. They cease being pilgrims and become drifters, flitting around themselves and never getting anywhere. To accompany them would be counterproductive if it became a sort of therapy supporting their self-absorption and ceased to be a pilgrimage with Christ to the Father. And perhaps this observation by the Pope is the counterpoint to the perception that the Church in the past has at times imposed rather than proposed the truth of Christ. Pope Francis is very strong in warning us against making freedom detached from God some kind of absolute good. He cautions us constantly against self-absorption and self-centeredness, reminding us, in fact, that we live in an age, and I quote him, when a new self-centered paganism is growing. This is a very valid point for all of us in Western countries, and Ireland is no exception to what the Pope is warning us about. There is a tendency, or better, a temptation, to want to create a society in which the spiritual values of the past are jettisoned so that presumably men and women can be free to live lives of personal enjoyment and gratification. It's this phenomenon so widespread in Western societies, and certainly not absent from Ireland today, which leads Pope Francis to observe, as I quoted before, some people think they're free if they can avoid God. They fail to see that they remain existentially orphaned, helpless, and homeless. Close quote. The problem of existential homelessness and emptiness is widespread in Western societies today. And it can be said that the richer the society, the more acute is the problem. Freedom understood as freedom from God does not create joy. Instead, it leads one into an ever more narrow alley of self-absorption. As I mentioned earlier, the influence of what we might call the spiritual geography of Ireland, the influence even today of an archipelago of holy places in Ireland is quite strong. But of course, holy places were made holy by holy people. And here Ireland has an almost unique antidote to the affliction of existential homelessness and emptiness which Pope Francis describes. That antidote is the living tradition of holiness with its astonishing riches of 1,500 years of Irish sanctity, from St. Patrick and St. Bridget in the 5th century to people like Matt Talbot, the Dublin-dwelling ascetic who died in 1925, or Edel Quinn, one of the original members of the Legion of Mary, who died as a lay missionary in Nairobi in 1944. People who, in the stunningly beautiful words of Pope Francis in Evangelii Gaudium, show us that, and quoting him, we become fully human when we become more than human, when we let God bring us beyond ourselves in order to attain the fullest truth of our being, close quote. This is the radiant witness to which authentic freedom ought to direct us, the beauty of holiness. We become fully human when we become more than human, when we let God bring us beyond ourselves in order to attain the fullest truth of our being. This formulation expresses the essence of Pope Francis's idea of the essentially missionary character of Christian life. We need to go out of ourselves, or better, we need to allow God to bring us beyond ourselves to become fully human by becoming more than human. This call by Pope Francis for a missionary transformation of the church by going forth is a theme which resonates very deeply in the Irish spirit, which has sent missionaries all over the world for more than 1,000 years. Pope Francis is indeed asking the church herself to be missionary in the sense of going forth to present the face of Christ to the world, but he also conceives of this missionary dynamic in a more personal, existential sense as our individual going forth from our own areas of comfort and security, whatever these may be. And here we see the particular relevance of Pope Francis' summons for the church in Ireland. As Archbishop Neary explained in his speech about Christendom and Christianity in Ireland, a society thoroughly Catholic in its cultural manifestations is a thing of the past in Ireland. But in a not so paradoxical way, the disappearance of societal supports and rewards for being a member of the church may well usher in a new period in Ireland in which Catholics see themselves not primarily as representatives of an ambient, homogeneous Catholic culture, but as something different, as people who have freely accepted the liberating gift of faith in Jesus Christ and in his church, that the freedom of their decision to follow the Lord and to live their faith in him will be only the more evident because of the divergence which that decision will entail with regard to the manner of life proposed by secular Western European societies today. The transformation of Irish society in the last 30 years also means that in speaking about issues of public policy in Ireland today, questions like the right to life of all human beings, or the reality of marriage as a unique relationship between one man and one woman, or on important elements of economic justice. The contribution of Catholics today needs to be based, in the first instance, on what it means to be human. We should not allow ourselves to be caricatured as seeking to impose or reimpose some kind of sectarian Catholic religious law on the wider pluralistic society. And so perhaps this is the preeminent value of Pope Francis's message for the future of the Church in Ireland, to resist the temptation of looking back in nostalgia to a time of apparent security, and instead to be supremely confident that the truth of Christ, which, as Pope Francis writes, sets us free from sin, sorrow, inner emptiness, and loneliness, Christianity as distinct from Christendom, will continue to infuse the hearts of Irish people with courage, compassion, and joy in following the Lord in our own time. I'm convinced that this is the case because I have seen it with my own eyes in the Ireland of today. And that makes me confident in saying that in spite of everything, the history of the Catholic Church in Ireland continues and will continue into the future. Thank you very much. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you so much, Archbishop. It's our custom at the Nanovic Institute to take questions from students first, and so I would be pleased to take some questions from courageous students.
Courageous students. Yes, there's one.
Bold. Yes. By the way, we have this interesting little square, and if you're young, we throw the square at you. If you're older, we hand the square to you.
Okay.
Yes.
Hello, and thank you, of course, for coming. It was very enlightening talk, a lot of working. I was curious because myself, obviously being an American and not, I know several people. Is it cutting in and out? Okay.
I can hear you. I don't know if everyone else can, but I can hear you.
I've known several people from Ireland at my undergraduate university, Oklahoma. We had a lot of students who were from Ireland, and it was a Catholic university as well, but you could see definitely a distance in them between taking part in any sort of the Catholic culture of the university. I was just your experience in Ireland, how certain cultural events have affected Ireland in the sense that, like with the movie that came out recently, Calvary, that really spoke about Ireland, and then this most recently, I think, the song "Take Me to Church" by Hosier, I think his name is, the Irish singer, that has really taken a lot of the youth and people of my age. They really enjoy the song obviously a lot, but it really has a very strong statement about particular Irish people's view with the church and things like that. And I didn't know if you had any insight as to how these kind of media-related things are influencing the public of Ireland.
That's a really excellent question. I have to confess that I haven't seen the movie Calvary yet. Everyone tells me it's a terrific movie. I hear nothing but rave reviews from all of my friends, and I really want to see it. I just haven't found the time to see it. Everyone says it's very, very accurate. And then the song, I'm not so sure I really know it, "Take Me to Church." I'm a bit culturally detached, I suppose, from that. But listen, I mean, there is among young people, as Archbishop Neri mentioned in those words I quoted, there is quite a bit of alienation from the church. But what it really is, in most cases, is kind of a indifference. Really, it's not hostility, but indifference. People have kind of been led to believe that life is simply about enjoying ourselves and having a great time, and that's it. You know, so going to Club Med and on a great vacation, that's life, and that's the best we can really expect here. That kind of very limited notion of what it means to be human is quite prevalent in Ireland. And I think that, you know, in large measure, the media probably foments that a bit by some of its superficial elements. But I think that at the same time, there is this growing hunger and thirst, I think, in Ireland, especially among young people, for something more. And there are some movements in Ireland of young people. There's one called Youth 2000, which is basically doing evangelization with young people, which is very successful, and making great inroads among young people. Another one is a thing called Net Ministries. And these things are great signs of hope for me when I look at the Catholic Church in Ireland, among young people especially. So I think that so the media that you're referring to, both of those, I imagine, are situations in which the media is in some sense perhaps encouraging people or asking people to think more deeply about existence. But I think that oftentimes is more the exception than the rule in terms of the media in general in Ireland today. But there are good things happening among young people in Ireland.
Another student, perhaps. Yes, sir.
Thank you once again for coming. You spoke towards the end of your talk about Catholics in Ireland now feeling less a part of, I think you put it, an ambient culture of Catholicism and more a part of freely chosen church. I wonder if that, if you would lend insight to whether that may tend towards a feeling that a small but devout church would be preferable to a large but relatively complacent church, and whether that is a potential consequence of developments in Ireland and in America as well, whether that is a potentially harmful consequence.
Yeah, I personally don't like to have to choose between a small devout church and a large complacent church, and the truth is always going to be somewhere in the middle, and the church is always a huge tent, a big tent. Catholic means universal. So you're going to have always people with great fervor and people who are on the border, kind of drifting in and drifting out. And I think we'd make a mistake if we chose either of those options as our aim. Like we aim to create a complacent large church, or we aim to create a church of true believers who are super fervent. I think that the challenge for Irish people is that, as I was trying to elucidate a little bit, that in Ireland it was difficult for people, unlike those of us in countries where we as Catholics are minorities, it's difficult for them to understand, to grasp the distinction on a deep level between the church and the world. Because when society becomes completely Catholicized, in the sense that the world and the church kind of merge into one. And I think the challenge for Irish Catholics is to begin to realize that the ambient culture cannot be accepted uncritically by them, that they have to step away to some degree and be critical of the ambient culture, and that is a key to remaining faithful as Catholics in Ireland today. But when the entire society is Catholic, how should we say, that concept of the church as distinct from the world and following the Lord as distinct from what everybody else does is difficult to arrive at. And one can arrive at it, but it takes time. And culturally it takes time to realize that to be a disciple means that I can't be just like everybody else. Because for a long time, to be Catholic in Ireland was to be just like everybody else.
Yes. You. There. Blue. Here comes the ball for the square.
Thank you. I'm a fellow history student, though quite unlikely to become an archbishop, I think.
You never know.
But I was wondering whether, for particularly Irish youth, Francis is more of an inspiring figure than his predecessor, perhaps because Benedict, with his long history in the Curia as Cardinal Ratzinger, seemed more of a bishop's pope, and Francis seems more of a people's pope.
That's a great question. I think that it's a complicated question because there's no doubt that that the presentation of Pope Francis, thanks be to God, through the media has been incredibly positive. And that then produces in the people a great love and affection for Pope Francis, which is a great blessing for the Church in Ireland. I think that my guess would be that you probably would see some divergence in different Catholic populations, if you can call them such. If you looked, for example, I think at Catholics in Ireland today, less than 30 years old, who go to Mass every Sunday, and asked them about the two popes, I think a lot of them would probably be very loyal to both, and perhaps quite affectionate towards Pope Benedict. So I think it's difficult to generalize about those things. But there's no doubt that the extraordinarily positive media presentation of Pope Francis has been a very, very beneficial thing for the Church in Ireland, for the Church in the entire world. He has a natural attractiveness which is contagious and very inspiring. So that's been a great thing. I think it would depend, whether young people are more attracted to Pope Francis than to Pope Benedict. I think that it depends on what population of young people you chose. If you chose young people who aren't going to Mass at all, and the only kind of influence or contact they have with the Church would be through the media, yeah, I think they would be, because Pope Francis is presented much more positively. But other groups who perhaps are more practicing in their faith, you'd see a divergence, I think, from that. That's just my guess.
There was another question. Yeah.
Good catch.
Archbishop, you mentioned in Ireland how the censorship issue with RFG and then subsequently the sexual assault cases really kind of took the Irish Catholic away from their faith. Maybe, I don't know if those were the two primary causes, but you brought them up. I guess I was just curious, the Church was a lot stronger in Ireland back then than it is now.
Undoubtedly, yeah.
If another such case of an atrocity or hypocrisy of that nature were to occur, is that very concerning for you in your job? Is that very something on the forefront of your mind that you think that the Irish Catholic community couldn't really come back from? Is it in more of a fragile state, I guess is my question.
Yeah, I think that, listen, all of us would be incredibly upset if there were more revelations of negligence and sexual abuse in Ireland. My guess, however, is that the structures, procedures that are in place now in Ireland, which I would say are second to none anywhere in the world, in terms of vigilance in the Church, in terms of child protection, it's extremely stringent, extremely vigorous. So I'm very confident that what we're doing now in Ireland with respect to child abuse is absolutely the right thing and could not be done better as it's being done right now. Now, whether some historic case from the past would come up as another source of scandal, that's probably always a possibility. We pray God it doesn't happen, but it's always a possibility. I think, though, that through the scandals, which have lasted for about 20 years, Catholics who are faithful to the Church, who love the Church, have been able to distinguish correctly between the sins, failures, crimes of the Church's ministers, priests, bishops, and so forth, and the teaching of Christ and the value of sacramental life and the Church herself. So, if yet another scandal were to emerge, I think there's been so much already. I don't think it would be so cataclysmic in terms of drawing people away from the Church, because the ones who are faithful through it all continue to be faithful. But I would say, and I would repeat, that the procedures and structures that are in place today in Ireland with respect to child protection are second to none anywhere in the world.
We have time for one more question, and then we're going to have some other remarks. Yes, sir.
My question is more political in nature, given your work with the Irish government. But I'm wondering, because I liked your answer about neither aiming for a large complacent church or a small church. And so I'm wondering what your goal, what your aim is, working with secular governments working in a liberal society that's sometimes unwilling to tolerate certain Catholic practices. What is your aim? What is your goal in working with those governments and trying to find and create the space where we can practice our faith?
Okay, that's a really good question. I mean, my principal goal is to create an atmosphere in Ireland that allows the church to grow and to flourish and to expand and to show her true radiance and beauty to the Irish people. So everything I try to do is to help the church to complete her mission in Ireland. Now, I have one of the most political jobs in the Catholic Church, really. I mean, the Catholic Church, we generally try to keep priests and bishops out of political jobs, but a nuncio is a political job. I mean, when I arrive in Ireland, I present my letters of credential to the President of Ireland. I have constant dealings with the Department of Foreign Affairs, so I have a very secular side of my work, which is unusual for a priest or a bishop. It's probably the only job, the nuncio and the people in the diplomatic corps, who have that very secular aspect of their work. And there, I'm trying to create an environment which is conducive to the church's flourishing in Ireland. I'm not a bishop in Ireland. I'm not an Irish bishop. Some people sometimes think, they confuse me with the Archbishop of Dublin. I'm not the Archbishop of Dublin. I'm a liaison between the Holy See and the Church in Ireland. But everything that I do is to allow the Church to flourish. And a lot of my work is purely political and, in a certain sense, very secular, but always with the aim of helping the Church to go forward and to permeate society as much as conceivably possible.
Well, Archbishop Brown, we thank you very much. Of course, we come bearing gifts.
Terrific.
It's standard for presenters to say something like, well, we know that you're traveling, we don't want to weigh you down. But we thought we'd weigh you down anyway, because you're one of our own. And so first of all, if I may open this for you. You can open it. And then I'm still going to have to lift what we have here. Oh, it's in 2 packages, and boy, it's so heavy. First of all, we have a plaque that is made by a local artist.
Wow. This is really nice. It's the Golden Dome, the administration building, with a little inscription. Thank you very, very much. That's really, really nice. Thank you. Done by Kathleen White. Kathleen Reddy White. Kathleen White. Thank you.
It's beautiful, truly beautiful work. We also have a new book, The Chapels of Notre Dame. It's introduced by Lawrence Cunningham, who's a professor of theology here, and Matt Kasher, who's one of the university's photographers. It's a truly beautiful book, and we knew that you would like it. And let me just say quickly, I just think we can all appreciate and be thankful to Archbishop Brown for the work that he's doing in Ireland. But to this I would add the tribute that he pays every day to Notre Dame, to his history education, the history department, and in general, as one of our graduates who really understands and exemplifies Notre Dame's mission. And so I'm very grateful for this.
And now a word from our sponsor.
For 10 years, I've not said a word at the very ignobly named Keeley Vatican lecture, and a number of people will be very disheartened to know that I broke the record tonight. I just wanted to say a few things, first of all, to my colleagues at the Nunavik Institute, who have taken admittedly a good idea and an incredibly modest sum of money that I gave them and created a really wonderful thing for the university and for the Holy See. So thank you very much to my colleagues at Nunavik. Very special thanks. I would be particularly grateful, Dean McGreevy, if you'd make sure Mr. Etrican got that message as well. So that'd be much appreciated. There he is, there. Charlie, you were this scrawny little kid in 1977, 78 that I thought had the perfect scam. He would stand out in front of the South Dining Hall with the World Hunger Coalition bucket. And I thought, what a great way to meet girls. Just what a great way. And it turns out for Charlie, it was a great way to meet girls. I just want you to know. I was far more religious than you were when we were at But from that has spawned a lifelong friendship, and I'm here with my colleague Steve Reifenberg, who can share the same type of sentiments. This wonderful friendship that we've made at the University of Notre Dame that has lasted a lifetime, and that has led to so many wonderful things. And I can't imagine what would be better in the world today than to be an undergraduate at the University of Notre Dame, questing for the truth, trying to figure out what is it that we're supposed to do. And to do that within the context, the loving context of the church and the great, great, great people like Professor McAdams that you have to learn from. It is really an honor that you would come back again. It has been a great honor for me to be able to sponsor something like this. Dear Notre Dame students, do not miss this opportunity to learn, to make friendships that will last a lifetime, and to help support your church because she needs it. So thank you.
I thank Terry for his very kind words, and just to say thank you to all of you for having listened to me this afternoon, and if you think of it, say a prayer for me for my mission in Ireland. I know Pope Francis is constantly asking for prayers. He needs prayers, but I think I need prayers even more at times. So thank you very much for being here with me tonight, and please keep me in your prayers. So thanks a lot.